A career spanning half a century with seats at many power tables, a career bureaucrat and former parliamentarian, NK Singh has shaped policy and watched the Indian economy open up and evolve. In his memoirs, The Portraits of Power, NK Singh chronicles his journey from Delhi to Davos. A telling account of his journey, the book also raises important questions about the future of the Indian economy and the institutions built to deliver governance. From fiscal reforms to federalism, there are lessons for future policymakers and plenty of interesting anecdotes for those who want a ringside view of what goes on in the corridors of power. It is my pleasure to have on the show the author and the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, Mr NK Singh. Mr Singh, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. And congratulations on your memoirs, which will be released on Monday. And this is a fascinating story. It's not just your personal account of what you've been able to live through, but it's also the story of India and its institutions in many ways, Mr Singh. Through the course of the book, one gets a feeling of how much has changed, but also how much has remained the very same. Let me ask you for your assessment on the things that you believe should have changed much faster. Where do you believe we should focus now?
Well, I think that you have used the word rather imaginatively. First, let me say that, Shereen, from Delhi to Davos, I wish you had added a triangle from Delhi to Tokyo to Davos, because a rather important chapter of the book is devoted to my experience in Japan. And indeed, the Delhi-Davos-Tokyo triangle would really suggest a much greater global reach. I think to your substantive question of that much has changed, yes, much has changed immeasurably. Much has changed from the initial period of what my chapter suggests, not only the roots, the time of my father, through whose eyes I saw a lot, but also the fact that in the initial stages, the struggle for food security. We now take food security for granted. But please think, Shereen, that the American sort of provocation that Indians live from ship to mouth is something far away in history. And that we are an important exporter of agro and agro-based products. Isn't it that an iconic change and a statement in itself of how much and how qualitatively it has changed? But your question, I think, Shereen, has a bigger meaning. Has India achieved or realized its growth potential? Certainly not. India's growth potential offers an opportunity which needs to be grasped in multiple ways by continuing the existing reform process, by reshaping agriculture, improving agricultural productivity, agriculture diversification, protein intake, by most important, reshaping education. I think that the power of technology in pedagogy of what it can do, what the pandemic has taught us in terms of a more hybrid and a more creative mix between using technology for online lessons with physical lessons. In the health sector, for instance, to give another example, it has brought out dramatically the weakness of our health sector. So I think that where India needs to go is to embrace fully what technology, 5G, artificial intelligence has to offer to harness its full growth potential. The book is also not only a story of India's evolution as an economic kind of an entity, but the evolution of how progressively we are embracing technology more fully.
Yes, you do talk about how India needs to embrace technology and harness and leverage technology to make more change. But Mr Singh, if I could address one of the central themes of the book, and that addresses the issue of federalism. And you know, today, as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, I would imagine that you really do have a ringside view of what goes into improving center-state relations, what can be done to bridge the trust deficit and to bridge the gaps that exist. Now, in the book, you talk about how the Planning Commission played that role, played the role of the bridge. The Planning Commission, of course, has gone. It's been replaced by the Niti Aayog, which doesn't really function or do what the Planning Commission was meant to. In fact, if I can quote to you from what your book says, you talk about how there is a gap and states feel that gap. They want an entity like the Planning Commission to bridge that deficit. What can it be? What should it be? I'm asking you this in the context of the fact that we've now seen the era of consensus coming to an end but clawing back within the GST Council. What's the future for centre-state relations?
I think we need to, I'll make three brief comments, Shereen. First and foremost, I do believe that the future of federalism and the philosophy of federalism must be broader and more widely based in terms of partnership which goes beyond fiduciary obligations. It's much more than money relationships. The broader philosophy of federal obligations and federal partnership in seeking to harness and realize the important national priorities. Second, you talk of entities and whether the old Planning Commission needs to be replaced by some other entity. I have hinted in the report that I do not think that it is fair to compare the Planning Commission with Niti Aayog. The purpose of the Planning Commission was different. It was, if you ask me, an extra constitutional body. It was a traversity of Article 282 of the Constitution, read with Article 280, because 282 enabled really schemes to be taken up, which were really schemes in the domain of the state governments. So I think that the Planning Commission, as an extra constitutional entity, did not enable some of the financial obligations to be fully met. The Niti Aayog, which is primarily designed for innovative solution as a think tank, was never designed to be an automatic replacement for the Planning Commission, which was a financial body. Third, what can be a future institutional structure for an ongoing dialogue of center-state relations? One important entity which I've hinted is the Center-State Council. The Center-State Council is a constitutional body. It is designed exactly for the purposes of bringing about greater homogeneity and congruence of views between the center and the states. Regrettably, this body, which was created based on the recommendations of the Sarkaria Commission report, has not been able to fulfill its original expectations. But in a time like this, I think that we need to rejuvenate this. We need to move the control of this Center-State Council, the servicing of this, to the Prime Minister's office and to the Prime Minister's chairmanship to be able to really use this body more purposefully for enabling a greater consensus being built on economic and social issues.
That's very comprehensively put, Mr. Singh. Would you say that this needs to be one of the key priorities that the government, both the centre as well as the state, focus on? Should this be something that the Prime Minister must, in fact, try and take forward as soon as possible, given the fact that we've got this chasm between the centre and the states, which seems to be widening today?
Which also seems to be converging once again, because the divide on the issue of the GST compensation cess has now substantially, that divide has been bridged. And even those who were critics have applauded the final and ultimate solution, because I had always said, and if you recall, Shereen, in my interview with you, my last interview on the Finance Commission, I had said that what matters is the debt and the fiscal deficit of the general government. The general government means both the center and the states. To some extent, therefore, this was a bit of a pseudo-controversy, which has now been resolved in a happy ending, if you ask me. So taking that earlier discussion further, I think that the leadership of the Prime Minister in addressing the pandemic issues shows that kind of fiscal partnership at work. How did he address the pandemic? After having given leadership role, in the initial phases of the pandemic, there was a constant dialogue between the chief ministers and the Prime Minister. And I think after that, the authorities were delegated, and the actual implementation of the decisions were delegated to the states. I thought that the way in which the pandemic has been addressed is a good example of a working fiscal federal compact with shared obligations, with shared responsibilities,
Yes.
and embedded in trust.
That's a good way to put it. But since you are talking about the PMO, let me address the issues that you raise in the book. You talk about the evolution of the Prime Minister's office from 1964 to where it is today, Mr. Singh. And you raise some pertinent questions. You also talk about whether the Prime Minister's office and the rise of the Prime Minister's office over the last many decades has actually led to an emasculation of the Cabinet Secretariat and the Cabinet Secretary. So what do you believe should be the role of the Prime Minister's office going forward?
Well, I think that the one important thing you must remember, two important things, Shereen, if I may say so. First of all, Prime Minister's office will and must bask in the reflected glory of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's office has no particular entity of its own. Its power and functions arises as an offshoot of what the Prime Minister expects: the implementation of his initiatives, the monitoring of decisions which he has taken, and some of the key areas where he would like closer attention. So I think that to some extent this is one overarching. Second, I think that depending on the challenge of the time, the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, which has been traced in this particular one, has always suggested that we need to have a healthy equilibrium in the powers and responsibilities of the Cabinet Office and the powers and the responsibilities of the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister's office is designed to only address the initiatives which the Prime Minister has taken to further the implementation, to monitor its ability to achieve the desired objective, and to ensure that the kind of objectives which were in mind in those policy initiatives are ultimately realized. The Cabinet Office, if you look at the definition of the Cabinet Secretary under the rules of the transaction of business, that rules of the transaction of business describes him as the Secretary to the Council of Ministers. So the principal obligation of the Cabinet Office is to function as a secretariat of the Council of Ministers. And I would like to say that this is a function which successive Cabinet Secretaries have discharged with alacrity, efficiency, and dedication. This principal obligation. There is therefore no clash or asymmetry in a certain sense. Yes, of course, the function of power will always change. It's in a dynamic evolution. It changes from prime ministers to prime ministers. It changes from orientation to orientation. And my last comment on this issue before I leave the subject. Shereen, if you read in a broader context, it is a global phenomenon that governments all over the world are moving away from a Westminster pattern of arrangement of governance, the presidential model. Presidential, not necessarily de jure, but in fact de facto. So, as the central leadership is, and what matters therefore is the adherence to, in a loosest sense of the term, or the original social contract, that the original basis and the raison d'etre of all governance is the relationship between those who are governed and those who govern it, embedded in mutual consent, namely through periodic electoral processes. And as long as that is so, I think this must be reflected in the kind of leadership in which the electorate have reposed their trust and confidence. But in general, you would say, governments all over the world have increasingly walked away from the classic Westminster pattern of the division in the governance structure to a pattern which is increasingly more and more centralized, and if I may use the word in a loose sense, increasingly presidential. This is, by the way, true of powerful chief ministers. This is true of powerful governors of states in the United States. I mean, the governors, it is true of the power of the important mayors in France. So it is really the changes in our entire democratic understanding of the electoral process, which is making us revisit some of the original contours of political theorists.
Yes, you raised that question whether the classic Westminster model is dead, if not in letter, then in spirit in your book. But Mr. Singh, let me talk to you about some of the issues that concern the economy. And you talk about the era of trade controls in India. You, of course, spent a fair amount of time in the Commerce Ministry, I think around 1969, if I'm correct. And in the book, you say, I'm confident that notwithstanding some recent changes, India will not need to relearn the lessons of the past in a bid to thoughtlessly embrace the new global fashion of rising protectionism. We're having this conversation at a time when practically every other day you're seeing a notification being put out by the government on import bans. Just last night, we've seen ACs with refrigerants being banned. Is this a growing concern now? What are the perils of this kind of protectionism?
So let me make, Shereen, three very quick observations. First and foremost is a broader issue. Has the world entered a new phase of deglobalization? Has the world walked away from the multiplier growth effects of multilateral trading patterns to arrangements which are more bilateral and which are more mercantilist? Has those who preached the lesson of free trade themselves walked away from concepts of free trade? I leave this issue unanswered because it is unanswered. That has the world itself moved away from the classic ways in which the Washington Consensus, which translated into forms of globalization and value-added chain in terms of enhancing the activity in each step of the value-added chain, has that model been invalidated by recent rise of protectionism and the recent forces of geopolitics? I'll leave that question unanswered. But it is an important question which needs to be addressed in a broader context of globalization. And therefore, that also raises, what kind of globalization is the world opting for? Is this a transient aberration, or is it a permanent change in the matrix in which we have seen the evolution of globalization in the recent last 3 decades? The second important point which you have raised is about India. Now, let me say this, that Prime Minister has clarified repeatedly that an Atmanirbhar Bharat does not mean a protectionist Bharat. Atmanirbharta is to be distinguished from protectionism because the first is really the ability of enhancing your productive capability, of providing employment, of providing jobs, and providing more gainful opportunities for producing things in the country instead of depending in a helpless way on our trading partners. But does it mean that we impose burdens and restrictions, which stymies the other important objective of using trade as a well-known engine of growth? Is clarified repeatedly. It is not, and that India has no intentions of becoming a protectionist country. India has learned the lessons of the past. That trade will and must act as an important engine of growth, for enabling a country like India to achieve the objective of a plus 8% real GDP growth.
Yes, that certainly is the hope, that we don't go back to an era of trade controls. That is what you've cautioned against as well. But Mr. Singh, a large part of your journey has to do with undertaking fiscal reforms from 2004 with the first FRBM to 2018 with the new FRBM Act. What do you envisage as the road ahead when it comes to fiscal reforms?
I'm glad, Shereen, you asked this question. I'm glad because you have read that part of the book, which argues, hopefully with some persuasion, that all past balance of payments crises of India were embedded in a few proximate years of fiscal profligacy. Most proximate cause of the 1991 economic crisis, about which we talk about, and the balance payments crisis between 89 and 91, was embedded in some years of fiscal profligacy. You look at India's history over a much longer period, the times when we have resorted to multilateral assistance as a balance of payment support instrumentality has been embedded in a fiscal crisis being significant. So learning from that, very important lesson. We did have, and it took an NDA government of Mr. Singh to have the first FRBM Act enacted in 2003, which laid down, broadly speaking, an architecture of fiscal rules embedded in macroeconomic stability. I think that it was a period of Mr. Narendra Modi that Mr. Jaitley announced the formation of an FRBM committee under my leadership, in which I had argued that apart from fiscal deficit in itself, the prime medium-term anchor must be debt to GDP. And the debt to GDP, not of merely of the central government, but as I said, of the general government, which means the states and the center. And that notwithstanding the current pandemic crisis, it's perfectly understandable that governments all over have given a fiscal stimulus, which is very, very significant, and moving far away from the kind of an era of fiscal rectitude. And that we have continued to be more cautious. Indeed, the government has been sagacious enough to not fall into this very easy option of a huge stimulus. You must recognize fiscal deficits today are not small. In fact, if you add the center and the states, fiscal stimulus available in the system is well over 11%, which is not small. But then we must recognize, along with fiscal deficits, we must ensure that we are nowhere near levels of debt unsustainability and nowhere near what is called the debt cliff. And that the road ahead, which I see over the next several years, is this. This year and next year must be years of fiscal forbearance. Thereafter, we must have the anchor again back in place, and over the next 3 years, period of the last 3 years of my Finance Commission's award, must also see the return to the path of debt and fiscal rectitude. Hopefully, after reaching what may be called the north point, we will begin to see the southward movement of both the debt and the fiscal deficit as a supporting operational target in the southward direction. This is all based on our expectations, and I'm sanguine and I remain optimistic that the current reform initiatives will make a decisive difference in the R minus G, which is the famous equation economists use, namely that the G is likely to see a northward movement based on the current reform initiative and more which are underway.
So 2 years of fiscal forbearance and then a return to fiscal rectitude. But Mr. Singh, let me end by getting your thoughts on the role of private capital. And you do talk about how we've gone from suspicion to skepticism when it comes to the role of private capital in the economy. And in that context, let me ask you about the budget-making exercise and what do you believe needs to change there? You talk about your own father's experience as Revenue Secretary trying to put the budget together in the book, and you say that It requires fine-tuning. It's always been an exercise within a very complicated matrix with political lobbying, demonstrated the ingenuity of corporate houses. So what would you like to see being changed when it comes to budget making as well as the way that government deals with private capital?
Well, on private capital, whether private foreign investment or private domestic capital, we need to exhibit, and we have exhibited, because if you remember, one of the quests which I had been fulfilled in the last 1 year. Our corporate rates of taxes were exorbitant by international standards. Certainly, everybody would accept that corporate rates are now competitive to similar international corporate rates. Now, of course, these things the gains from this and the consequences, the favorable consequences of this do not come immediately, but it comes with a lag, and unfortunately, it's synchronized also with the current pandemic. But I have no doubt that the far-reaching decisions on recalibrating the corporate rate tax will have gainful multiplier effects over the medium term. So my first point really is that we need to continue with modest rates of taxes. We need to reform the GST several ways, to which it is hinted in the book. Some of it is already underway. We need to similarly do equally the reforms of the direct tax code. Some of it is also underway in terms of a more friendly tax regime. We need to ensure that tax policy and tax regimes are competitive for the corporate sector, and that the fear of tax harassment is really minimized and become negligible by increasing use of technology. The two other critical areas I will just point to. One, Shereen, is when everybody looks at India, one of the areas they worry about is our legal rubric. They easily concede that India has a fair and transparent courts and judiciaries are fair, but the complex ways in which, particularly on economic matters, the tardiness with which decisions are forthcoming enables India not to harness the benefits of an objective judiciary. So ways in which we can reform the entire judicial system would, in my view, be a very important ingredient and comfort to the private sector. Finally, I would say that now is the best time to do so, of having the center-state partnership on the ease of business being continued, that when Niti Aayog does the ease of business, combines the initiatives of the central and the state government to focus on some of those key areas where we still seem to need a lot more to improve. So I think that the way forward, and on the budget making process, I'll make only one very brief comment. I've always said that based on the highest standards of budget making transparency and what OECD does, we need to have a peep in the budget. We need to engage Parliament much earlier than wait with bated breath on that for one day which will come in which everything will be unveiled in one package. I think that technology allows us in bigger scope that the budget making process, without necessarily compromising its secrecy and integrity, must be debated, must be more openly discussed among all stakeholders, not just in pre-budget consultations, which you and I know are set speeches and more perfunctory, but in more meaningful ways, judging from best international practices.
Mr. Singh, in exactly 30 seconds, we're completely out of time. I'm going to end with Bihar because in a way that is your karma bhumi. Is that a regret, sir? You've spent so much of your time there as principal secretary with the Bihar board, etc. Is that a regret that the vision that you had for the state, it hasn't lived up to the reality?
I can't say that I'm pessimistic. I remain optimistic that Bihar has changed significantly in the last 15 years. but socially embedded beliefs, and the psychology needs longer period, because I do believe that in terms of the two major forces, identity politics and development objectives, development must trump identity politics. The trumping of identity politics will enable BIHAR to move away from its traditional stratified structure of society and social norms into an area where greater and faster development really makes the entire stratification of the social milieu much more malleable. It is my hope and expectation that over the next 5 years, the people of BIHAR will elect a government which will guarantee them and which will assure them more that it is development, nothing more than development, which is going to be the principal focus of any government which comes to office.
Well, we could have continued this conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but there's so much more to talk about. And as I said, it's a book that is replete with anecdotes, the last 50 years of NK Singh in various positions in government and outside. Mr. Singh, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks very much and wish you the very best of luck with your memoirs.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Shereen. Thank you.
With that, we'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.